Hey guys, tonight we begin in a place that doesn't echo, not because it is empty, but because it is listening. You're standing in a room that has no corners, yet somehow it bends inward. The walls are covered in symbols that don't mean anything to you yet, but you feel like they're watching. The air is warm, dry like old paper, and it smells faintly of resin, crushed papyrus, and something metallic you can't quite name. This is the Hall of Thoth, but Thoth isn't here to welcome you. Not yet. He's writing. And he doesn't like to be interrupted. It's strange to think of a god writing. You might have imagined divine beings issuing commands in thunderclaps, not sitting hunched over a scroll that curls at the edges with humidity. But Thoth never worked in volume. He didn't shout. He scribed. And unlike the other gods who danced across the heavens with gold-plated weapons and sky-splitting displays, Thoth kept his head down. Literally. His ibis face, curved and precise, remained lowered in concentration for most of eternity. He wrote spells. He calculated stars. He recorded crimes, births, deaths, dreams, mistakes, secrets. And he never stopped. They say when Ra spoke the world into existence, Thoth was already there at the edge of the light, ink in hand, ready to record it. The first beam of creation wasn't light or sound, it was meaning. And meaning, in Thoth's hands, was dangerous. Because Thoth didn't just write the laws of the universe, he was the only one who remembered them. That's the worst kind of power. Quiet, unassuming, but permanent. His disciples, if you could call them that, didn't come to worship. They came to be erased. At least, the parts of them that spoke too much. The ones who asked too soon. The ones who thought that spirituality meant having something to say. Thoth was not interested in followers who made noise. He didn't need praise. He didn't want incense. He wanted discipline, stillness, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring and your bones itch, the kind of silence where thought becomes unbearable, and only then does the real learning begin. So when the first student entered his hall, Thoth didn't speak. He didn't even glance up. He just kept writing. For days, weeks maybe. The student thought it was a test of patience. It wasn't. It was a test of presence. If your ego needed validation, you failed. If your pride wanted recognition, you failed. If you asked, "When will the master speak?" you had to leave, go back to the beginning, and learn the silence all over again. Eventually, Thoth looked up, not with his eyes, but with a stillness that somehow shifted the air. And in that moment, the student realized the punishment had already begun. Not a whip, not exile, just the unbearable realization that they had never truly been listening. And that was only the beginning. The first thing Thoth ever asked a disciple to give up was not food, or sleep, or comfort. It was their name. Not because names are meaningless, but because they mean too much. The second you say your name, you draw a border around yourself, a shape, an outline, a set of expectations. It's no longer just you. It's you, as remembered. And Thoth had no interest in training people who still wanted to be remembered. So the punishment began gently. You were asked to write your name once, and then again, smaller, then again with your hand tied, then again, backwards, and then, without ink, until you were just miming the act of naming yourself. A shadow of identity, flickering across empty parchment. It was subtle. It was humiliating. And no one ever noticed when, finally, you stopped trying to write it at all. The lesson wasn't about obedience. Thoth didn't want robots. He wasn't building a choir. What he wanted was quiet. Not silence. Exactly. But the stillness that comes when a person stops narrating their existence. Most disciples didn't make it past this part. They fought for their names, defended them, added titles, added meaning. I am the one who dreams. I am the voice that questions. I am the child of stars and clay. It was sweet, in a way, but Thoth just turned the scroll over and pointed to the blank side. "This is what you are," he said. And that was his version of kindness. Later, if you progressed, your name was removed from records. You weren't listed in the initiation scrolls. You weren't mentioned in the temple hymns. If another disciple asked about you, they were told to be silent. The point wasn't to shame you, it was to protect you. From the ego that always comes slithering in, pretending to be purpose. Thoth knew that punishment wasn't always pain. Sometimes it was the dull ache of being forgotten. And yet, in that forgetting, something strange happened. The disciples who stayed, who endured the namelessness, began to see more. They started to hear sounds in silence. They noticed the spaces between glyphs. They stopped asking questions and began absorbing meaning in the spaces where questions used to be. Some even began to dream without characters. Just colors, symbols, and shapes they couldn't describe, because they had no name for themselves left to describe it with. To be forgotten, in Thoth's eyes, was not death. It was purification. Your name was never your soul. It was just the thing that got shouted before you were ready to speak. So he erased it, slowly, gently, completely, until the only thing left was the part of you that could listen. And then he gave you a scroll, blank, unrolled, pressed into your palm like a mirror. "Begin," he whispered. And still, you had no name to sign it with. Some punishments were designed to wound the body. Others were crafted to erode the mind. But Thoth, in his quiet cruelty, preferred the kind that turned inward, that folded over itself again and again, until the disciple no longer knew whether they were thinking or remembering. This was the curse of endless journaling. It began innocently enough. One scroll, one pen, one night. Write down everything you did wrong today, Thoth instructed. Then burn the scroll. Simple, reflective. Seemed like a lesson in humility. But the next night he gave the same order. Then the next. Then again. Until the disciple began to notice that the scrolls never truly vanished. The ash smelled like ink, and the mistakes, they always came back. It was never about guilt. Thoth wasn't interested in apology. There was no ritual of cleansing, no final forgiveness at the bottom of the scroll. What he wanted was something deeper, more disturbing. He wanted his disciples to see themselves, not as a story, but as a pattern. The worst punishment, he believed, was the realization that your failures were not random, they were recursive. You weren't evolving. You were orbiting the same moment endlessly, like a scratched song on a forgotten record. The journaling was just a mirror, a trap disguised as reflection. After a few weeks, the students stopped trying to be poetic. The ink grew sloppier. The excuses dried up. The writing shifted from grand moral confessions to smaller, stranger entries. I spoke when I wasn't asked to. I desired to be seen. I took the scroll too early. I tried to finish the sentence before I earned it. And Thoth read every line, not aloud, not in judgment, but in that way he had of reading through things. He didn't care about the content, he cared about the resistance, because eventually a disciple would break. One would stop writing, say it was meaningless, say it was obsessive, say it was enough. And that was when the true punishment began. Because on the day you stopped recording your failures, Thoth handed you someone else's scroll. "Finish this one," he'd say, calmly. "It belongs to someone who left before they were done." You would hold the parchment. The ink would still be damp. The shame not yours. But you would recognize it. You'd recognize all of it. And realize no one is original in their mistakes. That was the lesson. Not guilt. Not healing. Recognition. Thoth punished you not to make you suffer, but to make you see that you were not suffering alone. The curse wasn't the writing. The curse was the knowing that your struggles had been written before, word for word, by hands you'd never meet. And even worse, you would one day hand yours to the next. There was a particular punishment, Thoth reserved only for those disciples who were too clever, not rebellious exactly, not disobedient, just sharp, too fast with their answers, too eager to predict the ending of every lesson. The ones who spoke in riddles not to understand but to be understood. For them, Thoth did not scold. He simply waited until the next full moon. Then he took them outside, barefoot, and asked them to stand in the sand and look up. Not speak, not blink, just stand, feet buried, eyes skyward, and stay. Most assumed this was some kind of meditation, a star ritual, a secret unlocking of cosmic truths. It wasn't. It was punishment. Because when your feet are still and your eyes are fixed on something so impossibly far away, something strange begins to happen. Your thoughts get louder, then they slow down, then they loop. You start to itch, Not physically, something deeper. You begin to notice how restless your mind truly is, and you realize how little control you have over it. That's the first layer. But then time passes. The stars start to blur, not because your eyes are tired, but because your focus becomes unstable. The mind begins to rebel. You think of water, of breath, of movement. You crave interruption. Anything to pull you from this stillness. And that's the second layer. The desperation for distraction. The fear of stillness. The quiet panic that grows when nothing gives you permission to move. And Thoth watches. From the shadows. From the dunes. From inside you, maybe. He doesn't measure your posture. He measures your surrender. Not to him, but to the practice. To the absurdity of it. To the fact that nothing is happening. And still, you stay. And just when you think you've reached your limit, he speaks. Quietly. From somewhere behind your left shoulder. What do you see? Most answered wrong. They listed stars. Named constellations. Quoted poems. Recited equations. All clever. All wrong. Because the answer was never in the sky. The punishment was not the stillness. It was the realization that your attention had never truly been yours. That it wandered. That it escaped. That it needed to be trained. And Thoth trained it by giving you nothing to look at except everything. And nowhere to run but inward. Some disciples broke. Sat down in the sand. Whispered apologies. Asked for mercy. Some ran back inside. Convinced it was a test of endurance. A trick. An initiation game. But the ones who passed? They didn't move. And they didn't speak. They simply stood there, barefoot in the sand, eyes on the stars, until the sky changed color. Only then did Thoth whisper the next sentence. You may now begin to learn. There was one scroll in Thoth's archive that no one was allowed to read. It sat alone, always visible, always within reach, rolled tightly and tied with a thread that seemed too delicate to hold so much weight. It wasn't hidden behind flame or curse or illusion. In fact, Thoth placed it in the center of the room, directly on the pedestal where every new student passed during their first day. He never mentioned it. He never warned them. And still, no one dared touch it. It was called the Forbidden Papyrus, but not by name because no one knew what was written on it. They called it that because it felt forbidden. The air around it buzzed differently. The light bent more softly. And when you got too close, your heartbeat started to slow, not from fear, but from something older, a kind of reverence that didn't come from rules. It came from memory, a memory you didn't know you had. At first, the disciples believed the punishment would come if they touched it, that Thoth would appear in smoke and silence and banish them from the archives. But that never happened. One student tried, once. A clever one. Again, they lifted the papyrus, untied the thread, and unrolled it with steady hands. The parchment was blank. That was the punishment. Thoth made no remark. He didn't erase their name. He didn't speak their guilt. But from that day forward, they were no longer asked to copy texts, no longer allowed near the ink bowls, no longer handed scrolls in the morning. They were given silence, not the sacred kind, just the kind that made you invisible. To be denied words in Thoth's temple was worse than being cast out. The truth was, the scroll wasn't forbidden because of what it said. It was forbidden because it required you to want it. It punished desire, not action. That's why Thoth never touched it himself. It was his trap, and he had to be above it. Some said the scroll changed depending on who opened it. Others said it didn't exist at all, that it was just a test to reveal the fault line in every student, the need to know before they were ready. So Thoth waited, and the scroll waited, not for rebellion, but for longing, because longing is louder than questions. It hums beneath the skin, it eats discipline, and it always finds its way toward what it's told not to touch. The lesson wasn't obedience, it was timing. Knowledge, Thoth believed, had weight, and some scrolls were too heavy for hands that still trembled. So the scroll stayed there, unread, blank, glowing faintly with meaning that had not yet been earned. And every time a student walked past it, they were reminded not of the rules, but of themselves. And for Thoth, that was enough punishment. Not all of Thoth's punishments looked like punishments. Some were so subtle, so ordinary, that the students didn't even realize they were being tested. One of the most quietly cruel and deeply instructive began with a simple sentence: breathe, but not with sound. That was it. No scroll, no fire, no labyrinth of riddles, just breath. The most natural thing in the world until you were asked to do it without making a sound. At first, it seemed like a meditation technique, a discipline in presence, maybe. The students sat cross-legged in the hall of silence, surrounded by the walls that always seemed to absorb thought. They were instructed to close their eyes, inhale, exhale, gently, silently, and repeat. It was easy for the first few minutes, the kind of stillness that made you feel proud of yourself, like you had finally earned a moment of peace. But Thoth didn't tell them how long it would last, and he didn't let them leave. The minutes stretched. The air began to feel heavier, not because it changed, but because they did. The mind began to flicker, reaching for something to latch onto. A sound, a memory, a pattern, anything to hold in place. But nothing came. Only the rhythm of their own bodies, now under surveillance. Every inhale became suspicious. Every exhale felt like betrayal. One cough, and the punishment reset. One sigh, and the silence was broken. They had to start over. Entire days were lost to a single twitch of breath. But that wasn't the point. What Thoth was truly punishing was their noise addiction. Not to voices or conversation, but to inner volume. The way their thoughts narrated everything. The way they filled empty moments with commentary, even about the silence itself. I'm doing well. This is strange. I wonder if he's watching me. I think I understand the lesson. All thoughts soft, harmless, but loud in the space where the soul was meant to sit. To breathe without sound meant to think without narration. To move without defining the movement. To be without trying to explain what being meant. It wasn't stillness. It was ego disarmament. Days passed, or what felt like days. Some disciples began to hallucinate. Others broke the rule in frustration, letting out a groan, a whisper, a prayer. Thoth said nothing. He just walked past them as if they had never been there at all. And that, again, was the punishment. Not shame, not scolding. Irrelevance. To be unworthy of instruction. To be forgotten by a God who remembered everything. The ones who succeeded weren't proud. They didn't smile when they finished. They didn't ask for praise. They simply opened their eyes when Thoth did. And they rose together, not having achieved silence, but having finally understood that it had always been there underneath the noise they carried. That was the moment Thoth called them students. Not because they learned how to breathe silently, but because they finally learned how to listen. There was a chamber in Thoth's temple that no one entered willingly, even though the door was never locked. It stood at the end of a narrow corridor, framed by two obsidian pillars that never reflected your face quite right. Above the doorway was no inscription, only a blank panel where a title should have been. Disciples came to call it the Hall of Unspeakable Words, not because they knew what was inside, but because everyone who exited it came back quieter. Not solemn, not enlightened, just quieter. You were sent there only once. No disciple ever entered twice, not because it was forbidden, but because once was enough to change something. And once something changed, Thoth no longer needed to send you back. It was never announced, never scheduled. You might be copying a scroll one morning, or sweeping dust from a statue, and Thoth would simply look at you. That was the signal. Not a word, not even a gesture, just a look that felt like it had already seen what you were going to do next. Inside, there was nothing. Not at first. Just a stone floor, worn from thousands of silent steps, and a distant humming that seemed to come from the back of your own spine. Then, slowly, as you began to move, you'd see the carvings. Not on the walls, not on the floor, but floating softly mid-air. Glyphs, phrases, fragments of thought, suspended in slow, circling patterns. Some glowed faintly. Others were dim, cracked at the edges like broken glass. None of them made immediate sense. The rules were simple. Say nothing. Not a sound. Not a whisper. Not a breath shaped by thought. Because the moment you spoke even a syllable, the entire room would reset. All the glyphs would vanish, and you'd find yourself back at the entrance, heart pounding, shame rising, like heat from the soles of your feet. The punishment wasn't immediate. That was Thoth's style. You wouldn't be reprimanded. You wouldn't be exiled. But the next lesson would start again from the beginning. Whatever you thought you had learned, gone. You'd be handed a blank scroll and asked to copy the glyphs from memory. Except now, they were gone. And so was the permission to try. The hall existed for one reason: to teach the difference between knowing and needing to speak. Thoth believed that words were powerful, not because they revealed truth, but because they disguised it. And some truths could only be absorbed in silence, like a flame that would vanish if described, or a shadow that only moved when unobserved. One disciple emerged from the hall after 3 days. He said nothing for an entire year. Then, on the first day of the new moon, he whispered a single word to a blank scroll. The glyph glowed. Thoth nodded. The room fell silent again. From then on, no one asked what happened inside the hall, because some words are not spoken to be remembered. They are remembered to remain unspoken. Tucked into the farthest alcove of Thoth's sanctum was a mirror no one wanted to find. It wasn't hidden. Exactly, it stood freely on a pedestal of cracked white limestone, as open and accessible as any scroll, but students knew to avoid it. Not because it was cursed, not because it burned, but because it showed things. Not visions, not prophecies, just you, and not the version of you that others see. The mirror didn't reflect your body, or your robes, or the tired curl of your shoulders after a night of failed chanting. It reflected your shame exactly as you carried it. Thoth never told you when it was time to face it. He didn't need to. Shame announces itself like thunder in a clear sky. It arrives uninvited and stands beside you until you acknowledge it. One day, you'd be copying glyphs and your hand would tremble, or your breath would grow shallow during meditation, or you'd lie awake too long beneath the torchlight, unable to remember which thought you were supposed to silence. And in that moment, you'd feel the pull, a gentle tug, like gravity but inward. That meant the mirror was waiting. Disciples didn't line up to take turns. They went alone, one by one, often in the middle of the night when the corridors echoed more than usual. You stepped in front of the mirror, expecting to see your face, but it gave you no such comfort. Instead, it showed you every moment you hesitated when you should have listened. Every time you performed the ritual but not the meaning. Every syllable you chanted just loud enough for someone else to hear. It showed you what you looked like when you lied with stillness. What your eyes did when you pretended not to hope for praise. The punishment wasn't what it showed. The punishment was that you had no power to look away. Not because of magic. Not because of a curse. But because once you began to see yourself that clearly, you couldn't pretend not to know anymore. Some disciples wept. Not from horror, but from recognition. Some tried to cover their faces, only to realize the mirror didn't reflect skin. It reflected what lived underneath. Others tried to walk away too quickly, only to find their steps trailing behind them, visible in the glass long after they had left. Thoth never commented. He never asked what they saw. That was the point. The mirror wasn't a tool for him. It was a gift for you. A window that appeared only when you were ready to understand the true cost of seeking spiritual mastery. That no secret knowledge will ever be as difficult to bear as seeing yourself clearly without defense, without disguise. And once you had faced that image, really faced it, the mirror changed. It didn't grow warm. It didn't glow. It simply emptied. Your reflection faded. Your shame no longer held a shape. And for the first time in a long while, you could breathe without apologizing. It was small. You wouldn't have noticed it at first. A modest hourglass tucked onto a shelf in one of Thoth's side chambers, behind a stack of unfinished scrolls and beside a bowl of dried lotus stems. The glass was cloudy, the frame was worn, and the sand inside wasn't the soft golden dust you'd expect. It was heavier, grey, the color of ash from a long-forgotten fire. When it moved, it didn't flow. It fell reluctantly, grain by grain, like it had to decide to fall. This was the hourglass of dust. And if Thoth gave it to you, it meant he was no longer measuring your progress by effort, but by endurance. The punishment was deceptively simple. Sit. Watch the hourglass. Do not blink. Do not breathe too deeply. Let it finish. Then flip it, and begin again. No questions were answered about how long it took. Some students claimed it measured a full day. Others said it never stopped, that it just slowed when it sensed your attention wavering. There was no chant, no mantra, just you and the dust, falling like time made visible but warped. The first few flips were tolerable, meditative even. The grainy fall had a rhythm to it, like a slow drum echoing through the mind. But it didn't take long before the hallucinations began. You'd think you saw shapes in the glass faces, symbols, glimpses of places you had never been but somehow remembered. You'd hear a soft grinding, like distant footsteps walking in circle, and you'd wonder, was the dust inside the hourglass? Listening, Thoth said nothing. He would walk past sometimes, his feathered head tilting slightly, as if to observe not your posture, but your patience. He didn't reward you for flipping the glass. He only punished you if you didn't. One student left the room before the dust ran out. The next morning, their name was missing from the wall. Not erased, not scratched out. Missing, like it had never been carved at all. The lesson was not about time management. It was about time perception. Thoth knew that for most people, time was a trap, either rushing ahead or dragging behind. The hourglass punished the part of the mind that wanted something to happen, that itched for a conclusion, that needed a result, by forcing you to sit with time in its most stubborn, uncooperative form. The hourglass of dust taught you the secret Thoth had mastered long ago, that enlightenment doesn't come when the time is right. It comes when time stops mattering. Some students broke after 2 turns. Some flipped it 100 times and forgot who they were waiting to become. And a few, very few, flipped it once more, then left it untouched. When Thoth asked why, they said, because the dust already knows. And he said nothing, because that was the first correct answer. Thoth had an odd way of reminding his disciples that their voices were not their own, not their thoughts, not their chants, not even their whispers in the dark. He told them, with no trace of metaphor, that their voices belonged to the moon, not symbolically, not poetically, literally, and because of that, they were not allowed to speak during the moon's rising. Not for reasons of reverence or ritual, but because the moon might still be listening, collecting each syllable, each misplaced breath, and storing it like a library of misused sound. The punishment for disobedience wasn't harsh. That made it worse. You weren't whipped, exiled, or silenced by force. You were simply assigned to the chamber of reversal, a low-ceilinged room where you were required to recite sacred lunar hymns from memory in reverse. It wasn't enough to say the right words. You had to unsay them, backwards, with rhythm, with accuracy, with intention. Some of the hymns were pages long. Others looped endlessly, creating riddles that folded in on themselves. They weren't designed to punish the throat. They were crafted to exhaust the mind. Each mistake forced you to begin again, not from the line you botched, but from the beginning. Always the beginning. Most disciples cried before the first hymn was halfway undone. The lesson was not in obedience, but in recognition, that your voice was not something you controlled, but something you were entrusted with, and that trust had conditions. Thoth taught that the moon, unlike the sun, keeps secrets. It collects sound differently. It doesn't reflect light. It holds it. Just as it holds echoes of spoken things, things said too early or too often, things that were meant to be silent. That's why, he said, the moon was so full it was heavy with voices. To speak during its rising was to interrupt the collection. And when you interrupted the collection, you had to offer replacement, a kind of vocal tax, not in volume, but in discipline. You had to unmake what you had made, word by word, vibration by vibration, as if pulling the sound back out of the air and tucking it into silence. Some students didn't believe the myth. They whispered anyway, asked questions, laughed, hummed, and later, when they faced the chamber of reversal, they found their tongues uncooperative, their memories blurred. One even forgot his own name halfway through the chant and was never seen speaking again. But there were others, quieter ones, who understood. They stopped speaking long before they were told to. They watched the moon rise with closed eyes and parted lips, as if waiting for a permission that never came. And when they finally did speak again, it wasn't louder, it was cleaner. Because once you understand that your voice belongs to the moon, you no longer speak to be heard. You speak to be returned. They always expected something heavier. A stone tablet, a scroll bound in iron, a riddle carved in obsidian. But Thoth's next lesson, his next punishment, was deceptively soft. He handed them a feather, Not golden, not glowing, just a feather, pale grey, frayed at the edges like it had drifted down from an ancient bird that had seen too much. It didn't matter how long you had trained, how much you had memorized. The assignment was the same. Carry the feather for 7 days. Do not drop it. Do not speak while holding it. And never set it down, not even in sleep. Some thought it was a symbolic test, that it represented Ma'at, the cosmic principle of truth. And maybe it did. Thoth never explained. He simply placed the feather into their palm and said, "Now we measure what moves." At first it was easy. You tucked it into your sleeve. You cradled it like a sacred relic. It weighed nothing. But after a few hours, you began to notice how clumsy you really were. How many times you moved without thinking. How often you brushed past walls, bent too quickly, turned without regard. The feather would twitch, slide, float to the ground. And each time it did, Thoth would appear not to scold but to mark a tally on the scroll. A simple black line. Quiet, cold, permanent. The punishment was not in the feather falling. It was in knowing you had forgotten it was there. Truth, Thoth taught, is not an idea. It's not a statement carved in stone. It's a presence, a constant companion, something that must be carried at all times, through all gestures, no matter how small. And the moment you stop being aware of it, it begins to slip. Some students tied the feather to their wrist. Others wrapped it in cloth and kept it close to their chest. Thoth watched, unimpressed. The test was never about protection. It was about awareness. Could you live your life, not just your rituals, but your ordinary, unconscious movements with that level of care? Could you honor truth not with words, but with posture? With stillness? With restraint? After a few days, the feather felt heavier, not physically, but symbolically. It began to tremble when lies entered your mind. Not even spoken lies, just the ones you entertained privately. Regret, performance, silent resentment. The feather knew. It always knew. That was part of the punishment. You could no longer hide from yourself. The feather made every movement a confession. On the 7th day, you were told to hand it back. Some did so proudly, others with quiet shame. But Thoth didn't keep the feather. He placed it back where it was found, on the pedestal, ready for the next student. And the scroll of tallies, he burned it, without comment, because truth, like feathers, cannot be stored, only carried. And for those who dropped it too often, the real punishment was never being asked to carry it again. There was only one vial of it, a deep violet glass, sealed with wax, and bound in a ring of copper wire. The ink inside shimmered like oil on water, shifting colors in ways your eyes couldn't explain. It was kept in a locked drawer in Thoth's scriptorium, not because it was dangerous, but because it was too easily misused. It wasn't for transcribing teachings, it wasn't for copying sacred scrolls. It was only brought out under one condition: when a disciple confessed that they had made a decision they could not undo. Thoth called it regret ink, not because it contained regret, but because it exposed it. To be given the ink was not an honor. It was a burden. You were handed a blank scroll and told to write, in complete honesty, the one act you wished you could reverse. It didn't have to be grand. Some wrote of things they had said, others of things they didn't say. One disciple once filled the entire scroll with a single word, waited. And when Thoth saw it, he nodded, as if the meaning didn't need explanation. But the ink wasn't passive. It reacted. As the feather touched the parchment, the writing glowed faintly, then dimmed. The room grew warm, not fire warm, emotionally warm, like the memory had come alive, like the air was holding its breath. And once the scroll was filled, when your regret was made visible, you were told to sit and watch, because the ink did not stay. It began to burn, not in flames, not in smoke, but in silence. The letters faded slowly, line by line, as if being unwritten, not erased. Erased things leave traces. This was more complete. The ink left nothing behind, not even ash, just a scroll that looked untouched, as if your regret had never been recorded at all. And that, of course, was the punishment. You thought you would be forgiven. You thought confession would relieve you. But Thoth didn't offer comfort. He didn't read the scroll. He didn't nod in understanding. He simply let you watch as the words you had finally found the courage to write disappeared. Too sacred to remain. too private to be held, too painful to repeat. The lesson wasn't about repentance. It was about release. The moment you wrote it down, you were forced to confront the truth that no one, not even Thoth, could give you your past back. The ink burned not because it was magic, but because the act of remembering with honesty is its own form of fire. Some students wept. Others sat for hours, staring at the blank scroll long after the ink had vanished, as if trying to memorize what had been lost. But the ones who learned stood quietly, returned the vial, and walked out with lighter steps, because they knew regret can be held, but not kept, and once it's written, it's already begun to disappear. There was a door in Thoth's temple that no one could find on purpose. It wasn't hidden, exactly, but it only appeared when you stopped looking for it. It did not exist in blueprints or maps. You could not point to it and say, "Here it is," because by the time you did, it would already be gone. It was made of something like wood, but smoother, darker, as though carved from a single piece of night. There was no handle, no frame, just a surface, and the unmistakable feeling that something waited behind it, not watching, but listening. Disciples spoke of glimpsing it while meditating, while sweeping the courtyard, while pouring water into the basins, never when praying, never when chanting. The door hated attention. It only opened for the ones who weren't asking to enter, and that, Thoth said, was the whole point. When it finally appeared to you, you would feel it before you saw it. A pull not forward, but inward, like the body remembered a room the mind had forgotten. You didn't knock. You didn't push. You placed your palm against it gently, and the surface gave way, not like a hinge, but like breath through a veil. And just like that, you stepped into yourself, because the door didn't lead anywhere outside. It led to you, but not the you everyone saw, not the disciple repeating chants or copying texts. The other one, the one beneath the robes and the duties and the ambitions, the version you buried under obedience, the version that still asked why even when the answers were sacred. Inside was not a room but a space, a mirrorless reflection. Some saw a forest, others saw the sea, one saw a cradle, another a grave. The punishment depended entirely on what you found there. Thoth never interfered. He never entered. It was the one place in his temple he himself did not cross, because it was not his domain. It was yours, and some students were not ready for that. They expected visions. Instead, they found questions they had no language for, emotions they had numbed, memories they had wrapped in spiritual excuses. One disciple screamed for hours, another emerged in silence and never took another lesson. But those who endured came out softer, not weaker, just quieter, as if a knot had loosened somewhere deep in their chest. They looked at the other disciples differently, not as rivals, not as imitators, but as people carrying locked doors of their own. When asked what was inside, they always answered the same way. It was just me. And Thoth would nod, not in approval, but in acknowledgement, because he knew the most difficult journey was never across deserts or into realms of knowledge. It was into the part of yourself you pretend isn't there, and the most sacred doors are the ones that only open when you stop trying to pass through them at all. They called it the sandpit of silence, but that was only half the truth. It wasn't a pit, it wasn't silent, and it didn't belong to the desert. It belonged to the mind. A shallow circle carved into the center of the training grounds, lined with white chalk and filled with pale, fine sand that shimmered strangely in the morning sun. It never gathered wind, never shifted in storms. It stayed still, as if it remembered nothing of the sky above it. When Thoth told you to enter, he didn't give you instructions. He didn't tell you how long to stand or what posture to hold. He simply gestured toward the circle, and you stepped in barefoot. That was important. The soles had to touch the grains, skin to memory, memory to sand, and then you waited. At first, it felt like any other spiritual endurance. The sun on your neck, the shifting balance of your feet, the ache in your calves. But then something stranger began to happen. You forgot your mantras. The invocations you had recited for months began to slip from your tongue. You forgot the sequence of the moon rites, the difference between left and right hand in ritual placement. And then you forgot the names of your fellow students. Then your own, not instantly, not completely, but in pieces. You remembered the feeling of your name, but not the sound, the rhythm of your breath, but not the reason for its pace. And soon, it was like a dream without a subject. Something was present, but it wasn't you, not in the way you had always known yourself to be. This, Thoth said, was the cost of true stillness. Most spiritual paths tell you to remember who you are, to awaken the self, to build identity through devotion. But Thoth taught the opposite. He taught that before wisdom, before power, before purpose, there must be forgetting, because the self you cling to is always louder than the truth you seek. The sand didn't erase your mind. It erased your grip on it. It reminded you that names are temporary, that your story, your failures, your brilliance, your embarrassment, they are all sandcastles, and the wind doesn't care. Some students panicked. One screamed their name over and over, hoping it would root them back into place. Another tried carving it into the sand with their heel, only to watch it disappear grain by grain, swallowed by the surface like a secret too heavy to keep. But those who endured the silence found something else. Peace. Because once you let go of your name, no one can take it from you. Once you forget who you thought you were, you can begin to see who has been watching beneath it all. And when you step out of the sand, you are not less yourself. You are simply no longer confused about what that even means. It was an object that contradicted itself, a lantern but not one you used to see. It wasn't hung on hooks or carried in stormy nights. It had no handle, no wick, no flame. Its frame was made of bronze-black metal, bent in strange angles that the eye couldn't follow fully. Inside was not a candle, but a space, dark, unmoving, and impossibly still. When you looked into it, it looked back, not with eyes, but with absence. Thoth called it the lantern that hates light. No one wanted to carry it. That was the punishment. If you broke a vow, if you spoke out of turn, if you let ego wrap itself around your words like ivy, he handed you the lantern. Not to illuminate your path, but to dim it, to cloud your thoughts, to undo clarity. You had to carry it for one full cycle of the moon, from new to new, day and night, in study, in sleep, in solitude. At first, you didn't notice anything unusual. It was weightless, cold to the touch but never painful. But over time, it began to interfere, not with your body, but with your mind. You would forget small things, the line of a chant, the order of the stars, the difference between two almost similar symbols in your scroll, and then deeper things. You'd misplace your certainty, begin to question lessons you had never questioned before. You'd forget why you were studying, and eventually, if you weren't careful, you'd forget why you wanted to be enlightened at all. That was the lantern's purpose. Thoth taught that light is not always good, that some illumination blinds, that some truths, revealed too soon, destroy the seeker. The lantern that hates light was not evil. It was merciful. It dimmed the parts of you that burned too brightly: pride, impatience, the need to be right. It humbled you, not by shaming, but by unraveling. Carrying it forced you to see what your learning had concealed. The cracks, the assumptions, the parts of your soul that had memorized scripture but had never listened to silence. It was said that those who truly surrendered to the lantern would begin to see differently, not with sight, but with perception. They would feel what could not be taught, understand without conclusion, become fluent in nuance. Some, of course, resisted it. They lit candles, thinking fire would overpower it. Others surrounded it with scrolls and chants, trying to shield themselves with wisdom. But the lantern did not respond to defiance. It simply waited. And when the moon completed its turn and Thoth asked for it back, you were changed. You had not gained knowledge. You had lost distraction. And in losing what you thought was light, you discovered a deeper glow, the kind that does not illuminate, but clarifies. Because in the end, the lantern that hates light was never punishing you. It was teaching you to see in the dark. It wasn't made of glass. It shimmered like silver but felt like water. It wasn't cold. It wasn't solid. The mirror sat in a stone frame, the height of a person, surrounded by dustless air and silence so dense it seemed to hum. It had no reflection, not in the usual sense. When you stood before it, you didn't see your face. You saw something trying to be your face. The features were close, but slightly wrong. The eyes a little too wide. The mouth always slightly open, not mimicking but waiting. Thoth told his disciples never to stand before it without intention. This was not a tool for vanity nor for curiosity. This was a mirror for the soul's speech, and that's what it punished: misalignment. You didn't need to lie. The punishment was not for dishonesty, but for dissonance. When the words in your mouth didn't match the resonance in your core, the mirror would catch it. It wouldn't glare. It wouldn't shatter. It would simply respond. It would speak back, not in your voice, but in a version of it, low, distant, strained, as if echoing from deep inside a cave you'd forgotten you had built. You'd ask a question, and the mirror would answer. Not with what you expected, but with something just left of true. A wrong detail, a misplaced intention, a phrase you once said but never meant. The more you resisted, the more inaccurate it became. Until finally, it stopped responding at all. Not because you had found truth, but because you had stopped asking for it. Thoth said the mirror wasn't broken. It was merciful. When your words betray your beliefs, it gives you the gift of confusion. It scrambles your speech until your tongue becomes useless. Because sometimes, the best thing a mirror can do for you is refuse to reflect what you pretend to be. Some disciples stayed before it for hours, trying to outsmart it, speaking slowly, carefully, testing phrases, reciting teachings, but nothing worked. The more they tried to sound wise, the more the mirror mocked them quietly, gently, without malice. And then there were others. Fewer, quieter. They said nothing. They approached the mirror not to see themselves, but to be seen. They stood in stillness and let the wrong words come. Let the distortions wash over them. Let their image dissolve into something soft and formless. And when the mirror no longer needed to correct them, when their silence spoke more clearly than their speech, it offered something else. Not an image, not a phrase, but a feeling, recognition, like a wind returning to its source, like a truth that didn't need to be said to be real, because the mirror never wanted your performance. It only ever wanted your alignment. And once your voice stopped chasing perfection and simply settled into honesty, even the wrong words began to sound like home. It sat at the edge of the horizon, night after night, in the same place just above the dunes, just beyond the last pillar of the temple. It pulsed faintly, not like the others. The constellations wheeled overhead. The moon came and went. Even comets streaked past like whispers in the dark. But this star, this one, never moved, never climbed, never followed the sky's great dance. It stayed low, like a secret too stubborn to shine. Thoth told his students about it early in their studies. Not with reverence, not with warning, just a quiet observation. Some truths don't rise when you call them. It wasn't a lesson. It was a presence. The star didn't have a name. The astronomers ignored it. The mystics wrote around it. And the temple scrolls referred to it only as the Star of Waiting, because that's what it demanded. You could pray beneath it. You could ask questions, offer incense, whisper confessions, but it would not answer. It would not shift. It would not even blink. That was the punishment. You were told to sit beneath the star for an entire night, without expectation. No chants, no candles, no companions. Just you and the unchanging light. Some thought it was a form of meditation. Others assumed it was a test of patience. But those who stayed long enough began to understand it was not a ritual. It was a mirror, because the star's refusal to rise made you aware of all the ways you still expected something to happen. You noticed how your body waited for a sign, how your mind searched for meaning, how your breath unconsciously aligned itself to rhythms of arrival. And yet, nothing. No rising, no glow, no reward. And this absence, that gentle denial, forced a question deeper than most were ready to ask. Could you remain faithful without forward motion? Most teachings imply progress, climbing, ascending, becoming more. But Thoth's star refused that story. It didn't care how wise you were, how long you'd studied, or how ready you felt. It stayed where it was low, distant, unmoved. Some disciples grew restless. They tapped their knees, counted the hours, whispered lessons to pass the time. But the star remained still, and the stillness became unbearable. Others sat quietly, Not because they had mastered patience, but because they had stopped chasing anything at all. And in that surrender, something subtle occurred not in the sky, but in them. A soft unraveling of timelines. A peace that didn't require movement. A beauty in simply being near what could not be forced. When the sun rose, the star vanished. Not set, just gone. Like it had never been there. Like your night of waiting was imagined. But the feeling stayed. A quiet knowledge that not all stars are meant to rise. Some are meant to anchor you, remind you, humble you, and the deepest truths don't always arrive. Sometimes they just wait. It rested at the very back of the scriptorium. Not hidden, not chained, not locked in glass, just sitting there open. The pages were wide, cream-coloured, edged in age. No cover, no title, no author. It had been there longer than the scribes remembered, longer than Thoth himself would admit, and yet no dust gathered on its spine. No insect touched its binding. No wind turned its pages unless it was meant to. They called it the book with no ending. But that wasn't a metaphor. It was literal. You could read for days and never reach a final line. The story bent and branched, circled and shifted. It did not repeat, but it did return to phrases you thought you'd already read, ideas you believed you'd understood, names that once meant something and now only echoed like a song hummed too far from memory. Thoth never spoke of the book. He allowed only certain students to approach it, those who had already forgotten the difference between knowledge and need. He said it wasn't meant for learning, it was meant for undoing. The punishment wasn't for touching it, it was for searching in it. Disciples who entered the chamber, hoping to find answers, were quickly disoriented. The book sensed desire, and it responded cruelly. If you sought clarity, it gave you contradiction. If you sought comfort, it gave you paradox. If you sought prophecy, it gave you forgotten history that sounded like your future, but led nowhere at all. And yet, if you read without asking, the book softened. It offered glimpses, not of truth, but of pattern, not of destiny, but of resonance. It spoke in metaphor, layered beneath metaphor, not to hide itself, but to teach your mind to stop rushing toward endings, because endings were the disease. That's what Thoth believed, that the obsession with closure, the tidy final chapter, the revelation, the goal was the very thing that made people blind. That seeking a conclusion to the soul's journey was like trying to freeze a flame. The book had no final page because your understanding was not a destination. It was a rhythm, a spiral, a slow erosion of the parts of you that needed everything to make sense. Some students grew frustrated. They marked passages, made diagrams, wrote elaborate interpretations, but the next time they opened the book, the pages had changed. Their notes were useless. The story no longer followed the same thread. The characters had aged, or vanished, or reversed. But those who read for the sake of presence, for the simple act of being with the book, were never disappointed. Not because they understood more, but because they stopped trying to own the meaning. And so the book remained, always open, always unfolding, not to be finished, but to be returned to, like breath, like silence, like the kind of wisdom that teaches you not to reach the final word, but to dwell in the sentence that never stops becoming. It was always there, but only if you weren't looking for it. The monks called it the still wind, though it moved constantly. It passed through corridors and open-air sanctuaries, curled along temple walls, and scattered the loose petals of morning offerings. But no matter how many times it swept by, it never touched your skin. You could feel its presence, but never on you. It would rattle beads, flicker a flame, lift the edge of a robe, but your body remained untouched, as if it moved through space but avoided substance, as if it knew exactly where you began and refused to enter. And that was the punishment. Thoth sent students to walk with the wind when they grew too obsessed with results. Those who demanded signs, who pushed too hard during meditations, who wanted their visions now. He didn't scold them. He didn't lecture. He simply said, "Follow the wind that doesn't want you." And they did. They would walk the halls barefoot, robes trailing behind them like shadows. They'd wait at thresholds where the wind always passed. Some whispered chants to coax it closer. Others stood perfectly still, hoping to trick it into brushing against their arms. But it never did, because this was not wind in the ordinary sense. It was a metaphor brought to life, a teacher that refused words, a movement that required stillness from the seeker. The more you chased it, the less it acknowledged you. The more you demanded it enter your senses, the more it bypassed your body entirely. And yet, something changed in those who walked with it long enough. At first it was frustration, then sorrow, then stillness, and then, eventually, listening, not with ears, not even with mind, but with presence, a form of attention that didn't reach for meaning, but opened to it. That's when the shift happened. You didn't feel the wind on your skin, but you began to notice its echo, in the way your breath softened when it passed, in the way your heart slowed without trying, in the way thoughts lost their urgency. It didn't touch you, but it rearranged you. That was the lesson. Some forms of guidance never show up the way you want. Some answers refuse to speak in your language. Some presences never intend to comfort, but they stabilize you all the same. You don't get to hold them. You don't get to prove they were real. You just get to become the kind of person who walks beside them without needing evidence. The wind that doesn't touch skin was not meant to make you feel holy. It was meant to make you empty. So empty that you could begin again. So silent that even an invisible current could teach you everything you forgot to ask. It never rang after the deed. Never when guilt surged. Never when shame bloomed hot beneath the ribs. No, this bell was different. Older. Stranger. It only rang before. It was a small bronze object, no larger than a curled fist, hung not in a tower, but from a single rope knotted to a beam near the garden steps. No clapper inside. No wind could move it. No hand could shake it to sound. And yet, sometimes, it rang. Softly, like a thought you almost didn't hear. The disciples feared it. Thoth never explained it. He simply acknowledged its presence. That bell is not a warning, he said once. It's an invitation to return. The punishment came not from the bell, but from ignoring it. Because every time it rang, it meant a thought had just taken root. A seed of jealousy, a flicker of pride, a small, secret hunger to harm or deceive or dominate. Before action, before even full intent, just a shift in the soul's direction. And when that shift occurred, the bell would tremble. You'd hear it while reaching for something not yours, while forming a sentence with a lie nestled in its center, while considering a path that stepped slightly out of integrity. It didn't accuse. It didn't scream. It whispered. But if you continued anyway, if you let the thought ripen and become motion, something changed. The bell stopped ringing for you. Not forever, but for a while. That was the true punishment. To be left alone. Because once you had heard it, once you had known the presence of that quiet bell guiding your finer impulses, it was agony to feel it fall silent. You realized how much you had relied on its gentleness, its grace, its way of reminding you, tenderly, that you still had time to choose otherwise. The students who heard the bell most were not the wicked. They were the sensitive, the ones still close to the fault lines of their own nature. It didn't mean they were bad, it meant they were still in the process of becoming. Thoth never judged those who sinned. He only watched how long it took them to return to hearing. Some prayed to the bell. Some tried to repair their errors with extra rituals. But none of that worked. The bell didn't respond to apology. It responded to alignment. When your heart came back into rhythm, when your thoughts no longer leaned toward shadow, it would ring again. Not loudly, not triumphantly, just there, like a friend standing nearby, like a hand resting on your shoulder just before you slipped. And when it rang, you didn't feel scolded, you felt seen, because the bell was never trying to stop you. It was asking if you were still the kind of person who wanted to be whole. It had no handle, no hinges, no carvings, no inscription, just a plain slab of stone pressed into the far wall of the northern cloister. So unremarkable, most students walked past it for years before realizing it was a door at all. There were no signs, no warnings, no sacred markings etched in gold. Thoth never pointed it out. The monks never mentioned it. And yet, every disciple eventually found themselves in front of it, but only when they were truly, utterly lost. It didn't matter how well you knew the temple grounds. It didn't matter if you had walked the same path every day for a year. At some point, something would break inside your sense of direction, not in the feet, but in the spirit. You'd take a turn and end up somewhere unfamiliar. You'd forget why you were walking. The sun would hit a wall differently. The wind would shift. The rhythm would dissolve, and then you'd be there standing before the door that wasn't a door. Some thought it was a mistake, but Thoth knew better. The punishment was not the door. The punishment was needing it, because the only way to find the door was to lose your way, not just physically, but spiritually. It appeared in moments of doubt, in hours of spiritual confusion, in the deep night of inner silence when you could no longer remember why you started this path at all. It didn't respond to curiosity or ambition. It revealed itself only to those who had let go of control, and when it opened, it did so slowly. You didn't hear a creak. There was no breeze, no divine light, just a shift. The stone would lean, then part, revealing a dim hallway carved into the earth, worn smooth, damp, strangely warm. You didn't need to be told what to do. Your body moved before your thoughts did. Inside, there were no teachings. No instructors. No scrolls. Just space. A place where things didn't make sense and weren't supposed to. Time didn't pass there the way it did outside. You might sit for what felt like hours and emerge to find only minutes had gone. Or you might blink and realize days had passed. You didn't emerge wiser. You didn't emerge holier. You simply emerged different. The students who returned never described what they saw. Not out of secrecy, but because there were no words for it. Not mystical visions. Not angelic messages. Just the deep rearranging of something unnamed inside them. Thoth said the door was not a test. It was a kindness. Because even the most devoted disciple will one day lose their path. And when they do, there must be somewhere that welcomes the lost without demanding an explanation. So the door waits. And when you no longer know who you are, or why you're walking, or whether anything still matters, it opens, not to give you answers, but to remind you that you were never walking alone. It looked like any other pond. Shallow, clear, cradled in a basin of stone smoothed by time and footsteps. It caught the light just right, glimmering in the midday sun, rippling gently at night when the wind moved like breath across the surface. Birds drank from it. Leaves floated on it. But if you leaned over and looked in, there was nothing. No face. No shadow. No outline of your robes. Just water, even with the sky mirrored perfectly, clouds drifting, stars trembling. You, specifically you, were absent. Thoth said nothing the first time a student noticed. He simply smiled and said, "Good. It means you've arrived." But the student didn't feel like they'd arrived. They felt erased. The punishment wasn't that the water wouldn't show you who you were. The punishment was how it made you feel when you saw that absence. It revealed the part of you still desperate for confirmation, still needing to see yourself from the outside, still believing that you were real, only if something reflected you. Many disciples dipped their hands in, hoping to disturb it into compliance. Others tried to shine light from above, thinking maybe the angle was wrong. Some shouted into it, demanding acknowledgement. But the water remained silent, offering everything but a self-image. That was its power. You couldn't force a reflection. You had to release the need for one. And for many, that was unbearable. We are taught to seek ourselves in mirrors, in others' eyes, in achievement, in spiritual progress. But this water stripped all that away, not out of cruelty, but out of truth. It offered clarity, yes, but not of who you were. Only of what remained when you stopped needing to be seen. Some students sat by it for days, not to be noticed, but to notice. They began to realize the water wasn't empty. It was full of everything they weren't looking for. The glint of a dragonfly, the weight of silence between wind gusts, the slow unfurling of thought without narration. And slowly, they softened. The absence stopped feeling like punishment. It began to feel like peace. Because in a world where even spirituality can become performative, this pool reminded them that the deepest truths require no audience. One day, a student returned from the pond and whispered, "I didn't see myself, but I felt like something saw me." Thoth nodded. "That's how you know you're not pretending anymore." The water never changed. It never reflected a face. But for those who stopped needing one, it began to feel like home. Not a mirror, a baptism, not proof of identity, but permission to dissolve, because some parts of the soul can only grow when they're no longer concerned with their own reflection. It wasn't kept in a sacred vault or guarded by symbols of power. It sat on a simple desk in a forgotten chamber behind the Eastern prayer hall, an ink pot no larger than a pear, with no label, no cap, and no fragrance. The ink inside shimmered faintly under moonlight but looked ordinary during the day. Students were told they could use it only when they were ready to write something true, but they were never told what true meant. At first, they treated it like an honor. They approached the desk with reverence. They prepared their thoughts carefully, wrote slowly, their handwriting elegant and full of intent. But as they finished each line, the words would vanish. Not smear, not fade vanish, as if they'd never been there at all. Within seconds, the parchment returned to blankness, smooth and unmarked. Most assumed it was a test. They tried harder, wrote faster, wrote louder. Some shouted while they wrote, as if volume could force permanence. Others wrote verses from scripture, copied sacred chants, or documented what they thought were mystical experiences, but nothing remained. Thoth observed in silence. He didn't correct them, he didn't scold. He simply waited, because he knew that the punishment was already in motion. The punishment was the mirror the ink held up, the way it exposed the writer's motive, because the ink did not disappear. Randomly, it vanished. Only when the words were written to be seen. The more you tried to impress, to preserve, to capture something for validation or legacy or spiritual performance, the faster the ink dissolved. It rejected ego gently but completely, and the students who couldn't bear to be forgotten would stop writing. But some stayed. Some kept returning to the little desk, not to write scripture or philosophy, but to speak to the page, as if no one would ever read it. They wrote their confusion, their tiredness, their doubt. They wrote not to teach, not to preserve, but to empty themselves into silence. And sometimes, just sometimes, a single line would remain, not always profound, not always poetic, just true, in a way that couldn't be faked. One student wrote, "I no longer care if I'm holy." It stayed. Another wrote, "I miss who I was before I tried to become wise." That line remained too. The ink was not enchanted. It was not cursed. It was simply honest. It demanded that you let go of the reader in your mind, the one who watches as you narrate your life. It asked you to write as if the act itself was the offering, not the words. Eventually, the students stopped asking why the ink disappeared. They started asking why they ever needed their thoughts to stay in the first place. Because maybe the point wasn't to be remembered. Maybe it was to be real, if only for a moment. It wasn't supposed to do that. Sand was supposed to fall, to obey gravity, to rest once disturbed. But at the edge of the temple's inner desert, past the stone threshold, beyond the gardens of incense and herbs, there was a shallow pit, filled with fine, pale sand. At first glance, it looked ordinary. But once you stepped near it, once you disturbed even a grain, you'd notice the strange motion. The sand didn't tumble downward. It climbed, not all at once, not wildly. It wasn't a fountain or a trick of reversed film. It simply rose, grain by grain, spiral by spiral. It worked its way upward. Slopes that should have slumped became cliffs. Ridges that should have softened became sharp. And when you touched it, it resisted, pulling itself away like a fabric stitched with intention. Thoth called it the defiant ground, but it wasn't meant to be feared. It wasn't cursed. It was just misunderstood. He sent students to rake it. Not to fix it, there was nothing broken, but to feel it, to struggle with it, to watch their tools, their hands, their breath fail to change its direction. They were asked to smooth it into meditative patterns, mandalas, spirals, labyrinths, but no matter how carefully they shaped the surface, the sand would rise again. And that was the punishment, not the exhaustion, not the futility, the insistence of it, the way it revealed the ego's hunger for permanence, the way it exposed how deeply we crave control, even in our quietest rituals. You could spend hours crafting something delicate, something symmetrical, something sacred, but the sand had no interest in preservation. As soon as you stepped away, it began to climb, not to destroy but to undo. Students often grew frustrated. They muttered prayers, asked Thoth for guidance, begged the sand to just stay put. But he only smiled and said, "The sand isn't here to remember you, it's here to remember itself." Eventually, some stopped raking. They knelt beside it instead, watched the way it curled like smoke in slow motion, listened to the whisper it made as it sifted upward. And in that stillness, something softened. They realized that the sand was not rising in defiance, it was rising in truth. Because the soul doesn't move the way we want it to. It doesn't stay where it's placed. It doesn't hold shape just because we gave it meaning. It climbs, quietly, in its own direction. Even when it appears to be falling apart, it's actually returning to something older, something unspoken. In time, those who no longer needed the sand to behave would see it differently, not as disobedient, but as alive. And maybe that's what Thoth had meant all along, that the most sacred ground is the one that refuses to let your illusion settle. It was not cold. It hissed like any flame, danced with the wind, gave off light that painted the stone walls in flickering orange, but it would not consume, not paper, not scrolls, not the fragile pages of regret that students tried to toss into it when they thought they were ready to release the past. The fire was real. It would burn your hand. It blackened the edges of dry leaves, melted wax, boiled tea. But place even a single written word into its heart, and the paper would remain untouched. Smoke curled, heat pressed, but no charring came. At first, students thought it was broken, or enchanted, or perhaps some kind of test. Thoth said only this: it will burn what is finished, but not what is still attached. That was the punishment, to stand before a flame that would not take your offering, because most of the writings students tried to burn were not offerings. They were rehearsals. Pages filled with confessions not yet grieved, lies they hadn't stopped believing, stories they weren't ready to stop telling. Rituals, yes, but premature ones. They wanted release without reckoning. The fire wouldn't allow it. You could fold the paper 12 times, bury it in incense, chant 1,000 words. But if the pain on the page was still something you clung to, if it was written with pride, or guilt, or the ache of unfinished lessons, the fire would simply refuse. Some tried to trick it. They buried their real thoughts under ceremonial phrasing, hid raw feelings inside well-worded lines. But the flame could read intention. It didn't care about elegance, only truth. And truth, when it isn't complete, is not yet flammable. Thoth once whispered, "You cannot burn what you still need." That was the heart of the lesson. Students who stayed near the fire long enough began to understand. The flame wasn't a destroyer, it was a mirror. One that didn't reflect your face, but your readiness. If the fire would not take your pain, it meant your pain still had something to teach you. So they started rewriting, not to be seen, not to be free, but to understand. They wrote slower, less beautifully, more honestly. They stopped performing surrender and started studying what had not yet been integrated. And one day, without warning, the fire took it. The page curled in on itself like a dying leaf. A flash of gold. Then, nothing. No trumpets. No voice from the heavens. Just a quiet space where something used to live inside them. That was how you knew it was finished. Not because the words burned, but because you no longer needed them to. The fire didn't exist to cleanse. It existed to confirm the cleansing you had already done. And until you reached that threshold, it would remain warm, flickering, and utterly unwilling. It wasn't marked on any map of the temple, not spoken of during orientation. No one led you there. You simply found it. One day, while wandering through the lower corridors, perhaps chasing a breeze, or following a scent of old wood, you'd turn a corner, and there it was, a small room, no more than 12 steps wide, lit by no lanterns, yet never dark, containing nothing but silence and air that felt unusually dense, like something waiting. At first, it seemed like any other quiet chamber. You stepped in, felt your breath deepen, maybe sat, maybe stood. Time passed differently there, thin, quiet, slow. The room held no teachings, no icons, no voice, just stillness. But always, without fail, when your mind circled back to your name, you vanished. Not physically, but the room did. One moment, you were there. The next, you blinked, and you were back in the hallway, standing where you'd first entered, the doorway gone, the walls smooth, no proof that it had ever existed. The lesson wasn't explained. Thoth never confirmed the room's purpose. But the older monks knew. They had all been there. They simply said, it's the space between self and surrender. Because the punishment wasn't that the room disappeared. The punishment was that you brought yourself with you. Your name, your identity, your story, your role as student, seeker, disciple. The moment you grasped at who you were, even just in thought, the room released you. Not to harm, not to reject, but because that space could only hold what was empty, and your name was weight. Students tried to outsmart it. They used mantras to still the mind, meditated before entering, chanted so quietly even their thoughts fell asleep. Some succeeded for minutes at a time, but eventually, a flicker would arise. A memory, a label, a single word, and the room would vanish. It became a mirror for how tightly they clung to self-definition. The clever ones took notes, tried to document what they felt while inside, but no description ever survived the experience. The feeling faded too fast. The moment you tried to remember, it dissolved, as if the room erased not just its own presence, but your memory of what it gave you. And yet, the effects remained. Students who had been inside, even for seconds, returned gentler, slower to speak, less eager to defend themselves, as if something had been trimmed away, something unnecessary. The room was not for instruction, it was for unmaking, not to destroy you, but to remind you that beneath the scaffolding of names and achievements, something softer waits, something wordless. Eventually, the best students stopped trying to find the room. They simply wandered quietly, namelessly, and let it appear. Because the more you try to bring yourself to sacredness, the more it will hide from you. But the moment you forget your name, the door opens again. It sat beneath the Bodhi tree replica. Not the real one, of course, just a gnarled fig tree grown from a cutting, planted by a former disciple who had once travelled east in silence for a year. Beneath it was a stone, flat, smooth, almost perfectly round, grey with veins of silver that shimmered faintly at dusk. It was meant to be a seat, or so everyone assumed. One of those places where you sit and think you're supposed to receive something deep, like a revelation or a mantra or the feeling of being holy. But then it cracked. Not because someone fell. Not from lightning or weather or age. It cracked because a student sat on it and whispered something that wasn't true. Not a lie to others, a lie to themselves. And that was the first lesson. The stone didn't punish dishonesty with drama. It didn't explode or scream. It simply split down the middle, slowly and decisively, like ice deciding it had carried too much weight. That student, young, eager, spiritual in all the approved ways, had been saying the right words. I've let go. I'm no longer angry. I'm past that now. But beneath the words, the truth sat curled and twitching. They hadn't let go. They weren't past it. They were angry and pretending not to be. The stone heard that, or maybe it felt it, and it responded the way truth always responds to denial, by breaking what cannot carry the weight of contradiction. Thoth didn't scold them. He only said, "Now you know what honesty feels like when it's absent." The cracked stone remained. Students still sat on it. Some brought offerings, small pebbles, petals, folded paper wishes, and one by one, as they sat and spoke quietly, the stone taught them. If what you said was true, truly true, not aspirational or rehearsed, the stone remained still. But if your voice trembled with denial, if you wore peace like a performance, if you tried to trick yourself into sounding enlightened, the stone would shift, subtly, a faint creak, a new fracture, and that was the punishment. Not public shame, but the quiet knowledge that the world around you knows when you're faking. Over time, the stone became jagged, not broken, just changed. A map of self-deception, traced in fault lines. And yet, strangely, it became more beautiful. Each crack shimmered silver. Not to celebrate the lies, but to illuminate them. Some disciples sat on it intentionally to confess things they hadn't admitted even to themselves. I hate how much I want to be liked. I envy people who pretend less than I do. I thought this path would make me special. And if they meant it, if they said it without agenda, the stone sighed, but did not crack. Because that kind of honesty heals. The cracks were never meant to destroy the stone. They were just reminders that truth leaves a mark. And sometimes, those marks are the holiest thing we carry. There was only one, a single lantern. It hung from a low wooden beam near the threshold between the outer courtyards and the northern shrine. It wasn't ornate. No gold trim, no sacred carvings. Just old copper, speckled with age. The glass slightly frosted from centuries of dust and breath. During the day, it looked like decoration. During ceremonies, it was ignored. It never glowed with fire, not even when other lamps were lit, but sometimes, in the middle of the night, it came alive, faint at first, a soft amber hue, a flicker, like memory returning, not bright enough to light a path, not strong enough to chase away shadow, just enough to make you pause, just enough to let you notice the dark instead of fearing it. It only ever lit up for one kind of person, the ones who were lost, not geographically, spiritually, emotionally, the kind of lost you don't admit out loud, the kind of lost you feel only when all your rituals have failed, and the robes you wear start to feel like costumes, and the prayers sound like echoes from someone else's mouth. It didn't matter if you had the right answers. It didn't matter if you were disciplined. It didn't matter if you'd spent years in meditation. The lantern had no respect for performance. It lit up only for the student who had reached the quiet ache beneath the teachings, the one who no longer asked, "What is the path?" but instead whispered, "Why do I feel so far away from myself?" That was the punishment, to be bathed in light only when you stopped pretending you knew where you were going. Some disciples resented it. They saw it glow for others and not for them. They wandered in circles, trying to feel lost just to activate it. But the lantern could not be fooled. It didn't respond to performance. It waited, patiently, like a parent who knows you'll return after your tantrum. When it did glow, it never moved. It never pointed the way forward. It simply revealed that you were not alone in the darkness. And that was all it needed to do. The students who saw it glow never forgot the moment, not because the light was special, but because they realized how long they had been pretending not to need help. Thoth once stood beside a glowing lantern with a disciple who had finally crumbled after years of stoic silence. They didn't speak. The light bathed their faces in warmth, but neither tried to interpret it. After a while, the disciple said, "So, this is what it feels like to admit, I'm lost." Thoth replied, "That's the beginning of direction." The lantern didn't lead anyone out. It simply acknowledged you were finally ready to stop lying about being found. And sometimes, that was the first step back. No one knew who wrote it. Not even Thoth. At least, not that he admitted. The book was always there, resting on a small pedestal carved from volcanic stone, tucked in the farthest corner of the scriptorium, where dust moved slower than time. Bound in cracked leather, its pages thick like pressed leaves. There was no title, no author, no signature, just a faint scent of ink and something old as cedar, maybe, or memory. The rule was simple. You could read it only once per day. That's all it would allow. When a disciple approached, the book opened itself sometimes to the beginning, sometimes to a page halfway through, sometimes to a part they didn't understand, but never twice to the same words. Never the same sequence, not even the same language at times. It wrote itself as you read it. Or more precisely, it rewrote itself based on what you refused to see. That was the punishment. Not the rewriting, but the revealing. The book responded to your inner distortions. If you were angry, it offered lessons in forgiveness, but only in the form of confusing parables that left you unsettled. If you were arrogant, it mocked you with stories of failed sages. If you were afraid, it gave you riddles so circular they forced you inward. The book didn't try to teach what you wanted, only what you needed. Wrapped in layers you weren't always ready to unwrap. Some tried to memorize the pages, came back the next day with notes, hoping to match what they'd read before, but the words had vanished, replaced by new ones, sometimes even new truths. Students would argue, debate what the book really said, but no one was ever right for long, because the book knew when your certainty had calcified into ego. One disciple, after weeks of reading, confessed, "It keeps contradicting itself." Thoth nodded. "That means it's working." Eventually, they stopped asking the book to behave. They let go of the hope that it would give them answers that made them feel wise. Instead, they learned to meet the pages the way one meets a mirror, in dim light, not to admire, but to notice. The book showed them where they stood, not where they pretended to be. Its wisdom wasn't fixed, it was reflective. And reflection, as Thoth often said, is only as honest as the stillness of the water. Those who tried to cheat it, those who asked others what they read, tried to decode patterns, uncover a hidden structure, all left frustrated, because the book did not care about collective truth. It was a private conversation, one between your soul and whatever part of you still clung to the idea that enlightenment was a finish line, the pages never stopped changing, and neither did the reader. And maybe that was the point, not to find the final version of the book, but to finally admit that you were still being written too. It looked like ordinary ink, stored in a small clay pot beside the elder scribe's desk. It had no glow, no fragrance, no shimmer to catch the eye. But Thoth warned them. This ink does not write for the world. It writes only for the soul. The warning, of course, was ignored by many, especially by the newer students, the ones still intoxicated by revelation, still dazzled by the glow of self-discovery. The ink, to them, was an invitation to record their brilliance. At first, it worked. They dipped their quills and wrote pages of insight. Poetry, born of fasting. Truths whispered during midnight meditations. Realizations they believed would change everything. The words flowed beautiful, vulnerable, profound, and when they read them back aloud to themselves, they swore the ink glistened with approval. But the moment they showed it to others, something strange happened. The writing began to fade, not all at once, not instantly, but like fog being lifted by a quiet wind. Line by line, curve by curve, the words dissolved. Entire passages disappeared mid-sentence. What once felt holy now looked like blank parchment, stained only with the residue of ego. That was the punishment, not public humiliation, but personal erasure. A reminder that not everything sacred is meant to be shared. Some insights exist only to transform the one who receives them, not to earn applause, not to teach, not to shine. The ink knew the difference. Thoth explained it this way. When you announce your depth before it has rooted, the depth becomes shallow, and shallow waters do not hold ink. Students began to fear the ink. Some refused to use it. They wrote only with the communal charcoal blend, safe and smudgy, proofed for display. But the brave ones returned. They understood. The ink was never meant for proclamation, it was a mirror for humility. The less you needed others to see it, the darker the ink stayed. A disciple once wrote, "I'm finally free from the need to impress." The ink didn't dry. Another wrote, "I no longer seek validation." By morning, the page was empty. But one evening, a student scribbled quietly, "I am still learning to be unseen." She closed the journal without reading it, never mentioned it to anyone, never showed the page again. Weeks later, the ink remained, bold and black, because she hadn't written it for proof. The ink responded only to those who no longer needed their wisdom to be visible. That was the mystery. The fainter your need to shine, the stronger your mark became. Eventually, students used the ink only when they felt unsure, when they wanted to confess to themselves, not perform for others. Some pages were burned, some buried, others simply tucked beneath pillows, their words known only to silence, and the ink stayed, not because the words were brilliant, but because they were honest. They said it had not rung in centuries. It was suspended high above the Eastern Tower, where few ever climbed, and no one dared speak. Shaped like a lotus turned upside down, forged from bronze so old its green patina looked like moss. There was no rope, no mallet, no mechanism. It simply sat there, heavy and silent, as if waiting for something most had forgotten how to give. Every student, at some point, tried to make it sound. They meditated beneath it, fasted for days, whispered mantras into its cold skin. Some recited chants in perfect rhythm. Others wept beside it, offering grief like currency. A few climbed all the way up just to touch it with trembling fingers, hoping some latent vibration might awaken it. But nothing, not a hum, not a tremble, not even the echo of air. And yet, the stories remained. They spoke of a monk who heard it ring once, just once, while carrying water in silence, unaware it even existed. Another said it rang when a disciple gave up on becoming anything at all and simply swept the courtyard for a year. But no one could prove it. The bell had no schedule, no favor, no logic, and that, of course, was its lesson. The punishment wasn't in the silence. The punishment was in your waiting, because the more you needed it to ring, the more it refused. The more you listened for it, strained for it, prayed for it, the more distant it became, like trying to hear the sound of your own name in a dream that no longer wants to remember you. Thoth once said, "The bell rings only when it is no longer the thing you seek." And so, Eventually, the students stopped listening. They let go. They lived. They breathed and walked and forgot. They did not abandon the bell, but they ceased needing it. And that was when, late one evening, during the changing of sandals by the door, it happened. A sound soft and full, not loud, but impossibly clear. A single note that filled every hallway. No one claimed it. No one raced to confirm it. They just stood there, still, as if they'd heard something sacred that had nothing to do with ears. And that was enough. It wasn't large. Tucked behind the east wall, shielded from the wind, the garden was barely the size of a courtyard. Just a patch of soil, a few crooked rows, a low stone path spiraling inward like a sleepy labyrinth. There were no dramatic blossoms, no imported trees, mostly herbs, sage, basil, wild mint that crept where it wasn't planted. A single fig tree near the far edge, always in a state of almost fruit. At first, the students tended to it obsessively. Charts were drawn, soil pH was measured, stones were rearranged for aesthetic flow, rituals were performed before planting, prayers were whispered over seedlings as if coaxing them to sprout early. They believed the garden was symbolic, another sacred metaphor to be mastered. But nothing grew quickly. The mint withered. The fig dropped its buds. The basil refused to rise, and when it did, it curled in on itself, as if protesting the attention. Frustration spread like weeds. Students blamed the climate, the seed quality, the insects. They invented reasons for the garden's resistance, imagining mystical explanations. It responds only to certain moon phases, one said. It grows in proportion to your internal stillness, said another. Thoth said nothing, until one day he closed the garden gates, hung a sign that simply read, "Do not tend, do not look." They were confused. A few tried to peek, a few sneaked in at night, but eventually the curiosity faded. Other chores called, meditation resumed, time passed. And then, weeks later, the scent drifted out, thick with rosemary and damp earth. The mint had returned. The basil was tall. The fig bore fruit, not many, but enough. When the gates reopened, the garden looked full, untamed but thriving, alive in a way it hadn't been before. The students were stunned. "Why now?" one whispered. Thoth replied, "Because you stopped watching." That was the punishment. Not that the garden refused to grow, but that it refused to grow for your ego. It grew only when it was no longer being demanded to grow, when it was free to breathe in its own rhythm, when it wasn't being used as a mirror for your effort. The garden didn't reward neglect, but it responded to humility, to surrender, to the slow, wordless kind of care that lives in silence, not control. After that, the students learned to garden differently. They planted without needing harvest. They watered without needing thanks. And when the fig tree finally dropped a single ripe fruit into the dirt, none of them picked it. They just sat quietly and let it rot back into the soil, because not all growth is meant to be consumed. It had no door, just an archway carved into the temple's oldest wall, half covered in ivy that no one ever trimmed. The room beyond was not grand bare stone, no windows, no torches. The only light came from the way the sun slanted through the opening at certain hours, as if it had learned when to visit and when to leave it alone. There were no symbols, no cushions, no incense, nothing that welcomed you. And yet, once you stepped inside, you didn't want to leave. They called it the nameless room, because that's what it took from you. Not your possessions, not your robes, not your beliefs, just your name. Not with force, not suddenly, but gently, like water smoothing stone. At first, you'd remember who you were. You'd repeat it in your head, recite your stories, recall your titles. But the longer you sat in the stillness, the more those words became distant. They stopped meaning anything. You were still you, but without the label. That was the punishment. Not forgetting your name, but realizing how small it really was. Some students panicked. They fled before the forgetting took hold, clutching their identity like a life raft. Others stayed too long, thinking they could master it, hoping to return with secret knowledge, but the room offered no revelations, only silence. And in that silence, your name dissolved. Thoth warned them. If your name is the only thing keeping you whole, don't step through, because the room would not return it to you. You had to find it again or choose not to. Those who entered without grasping, who allowed themselves to be unlabeled for a while, emerged changed. Not lost, just lighter. They spoke less, walked slower, didn't correct others when mistaken. It wasn't humility, it was relief. They had tasted the space beneath the story, and they no longer needed to shout themselves back into being. One disciple, after an hour inside, stepped out and simply said, "I am not who I was, but I am more." The room never answered questions. It never took the same thing twice. For some, it erased ambition. For others, grief. For a few, it erased their gods. But it never did so cruelly. It merely invited you to sit without your roles and see what remained. And what remained was often enough. Because, under the name you've rehearsed, under the identity you've performed, there is still you, still breathing, still whole, still held. It was not grand. The staircase was narrow and rough, carved from porous black stone that flaked under your fingertips. There were no railings, no torches, no gold-leafed inscriptions warning you of the path ahead. Just a sign at the bottom, painted so faintly it looked like shadow. One step at a time, or none at all. Most didn't notice it at first. Tucked behind the lesser-known library hall, the staircase seemed ordinary, at least until you tried to climb it. Then it changed, always subtly. The moment your foot lifted, something shifted, not in the steps, but in you, like your weight had suddenly increased. Not physical weight, but something older. Expectations, desperation, wanting. Every step became heavier than the last. Most turned back before the fifth. A few students, frustrated, tried to race upward, convinced that momentum would overcome the resistance. But the faster they moved, the harder the stone seemed to push back. Some slipped. Some shouted. One wept openly halfway up and slid back down, as if gravity had decided to personally reject him. But the staircase wasn't cruel. It was mirrored. It responded only to effort, and not the kind that moves you forward, but the kind that holds you back. Striving, ambition, ego disguised as discipline. The more you tried to conquer the stairs, the less they allowed you to rise. Thoth said nothing about it. When asked, he would smile and say, "That staircase doesn't lead anywhere unless you stop trying to arrive." Which made no sense. Until it did. One disciple, quiet, nameless, uninterested in progress, simply stood at the base and breathed. He wasn't performing calmness. He wasn't manipulating surrender to trigger some response. He just gave up the idea that up mattered more than here. He placed one foot on the first step and felt nothing unusual. Then another. Then another. He walked to the top with ease, and when he came down again, he said only, "The staircase disappears the moment you no longer need to climb it." That was the punishment, not a test of physical strength, but a test of intention. You could not ascend with the mindset of escape. You could not reach the top if the top was what you craved. The staircase honored only those who understood that elevation was not a destination, but a byproduct of presence. Eventually, the wiser students approached it differently. They sat at the base, not in defeat, but in understanding. They stopped treating spiritual progress like a ladder. They waited, not passively, but openly, until the step revealed itself. Some days, one step moved. Some days, none. One disciple sat there for 72 evenings, never rising, never falling. And then one dawn the staircase lifted him, literally, without motion, without sound. He found himself at the top before he realized he had even begun. And what was at the top? Nothing. Just an empty stone platform, a flat space open to the sky. No temple, no scrolls, no revelation, just wind and distance. And in that space, the realization that the climb had never been about arrival at all. The real reward was the softening that occurred in the not getting there, the stillness forged in refusal, the grace that bloomed once the desperation was surrendered. That's what the staircase was for. It existed to wear down your spiritual ambition, to sand away your hunger for proof, and leave behind the kind of humility that asks for nothing, and therefore receives everything. Those who never reached the top learned just as much as those who did, because the staircase, in the end, wasn't even real. It was just the shape your need for progress took, until you realized you were already where you were meant to be. And the stone underfoot? It had always been softening, waiting for you to stop pretending the only way forward was up. It didn't begin with a rule. There was no decree from Thoth, no ceremony, no carved signpost telling the students what to do. The silence simply emerged one day, stretching itself like a cat through the temple corridors, curling beneath doorways, nesting in the corners of the stone halls. It was not absolute. Birds still chirped in the distance. The wind still whispered through the slats. But within the temple walls, the usual chime of conversation faded. At first, no one questioned it. They assumed it was coincidence, a lull between classes, a meditative phase. But the quiet lingered. When one student tried to speak just a greeting, a simple hello, the air around him felt thick. The words fell out like pebbles, heavy and unwelcome. Another tried to hum while sweeping the floor, only to find her throat tightening inexplicably. The notes turned brittle in her mouth. Still, no one was punished. Not in any visible way. But something changed. Those who broke the silence began to lose things, not possessions, but clarity. A student who whispered questions during prayer forgot his place in the scriptures. Another who spoke excitedly during a walk to the garden found her dreams filled with static. One confessed that after speaking aloud too soon, he could no longer hear the bell tower's midnight chime. Even though others swore it still rang, it became clear. The silence was not passive, it was a presence, and when you disrespected it, when you filled it with your own noise before you had listened long enough, it turned away from you. Not violently, not with anger, just with withdrawal. It stopped teaching you. That was the punishment. You weren't scolded. You weren't corrected. You were simply left alone with your noise. Thoth, of course, said nothing. He did not enforce the silence. He didn't have to. Silence, once awakened, governs itself, and it punishes not with volume, but with absence. When you speak before understanding, the silence stops offering what you were meant to hear. Some students began timing their words, measuring out pauses, speaking in riddles, thinking that cryptic phrasing would somehow honor the quiet. But the silence saw through that. It punished cleverness even more swiftly than carelessness. You could not manipulate it. You could only meet it. And to meet it, you had to become very, very small. One disciple, curious and patient, sat alone in the scriptorium for 7 days, never speaking, not even internally. She didn't meditate, didn't chase mantras, just listened, not with ears, but with attention, with reverence. And when she finally whispered a single word, "now," the room answered back, not in sound, but in knowing. She understood a passage in Thoth's writings she'd reread 100 times before. The letters glowed, not visually, but within her, and everything aligned. The silence had taught her, not with words, but through what words could never hold. That was its gift. The deeper you listened, the more it gave. But if you tried to rush it, if you filled it with commentary, analysis, excitement, you drove it away. And with it went the understanding you didn't even know you were asking for. It was said that silence was Thoth's first disciple, that before there were scribes, or books, or rituals, there was only quiet. And the quiet wrote everything, not on paper, but in being. The temple, the teachings, even the gods, they all bloomed from a kind of soundlessness so deep it could only be mistaken for void. But it was not empty. It was full, so full that any word placed inside it shattered. And so, silence became the test, not of restraint, but of reverence. Could you bear not to explain yourself? Could you sit in the presence of mystery without fumbling for language? Could you walk past the fig tree in bloom and not say, "How beautiful"? Those who could were rewarded. They received what cannot be passed on, not teachings, not truths, but the state beneath knowing, the kind of knowing that lives beneath your name, beneath your thoughts, beneath even your breath, the kind of knowing that can only visit when you've stopped asking for it, the kind of knowing that makes words unnecessary. And that, of course, is why the silence punished so gently. It wanted to be heard, but only by those who understood that hearing has nothing to do with sound. They said the room moved, not like a creature, not with footsteps or hinges, but subtly like a shadow that shifts with the sun, or a memory that gets blurry when you try too hard to explain it. One day it was behind the kitchen where the novice monks peeled onions in silence. Another day it opened behind the archives, tucked between two shelves where no room had ever been before. Sometimes it was just a thin door in a wall that hadn't had a door the day before. No one ever saw it appear. But when it did, the air around it changed. It felt thinner, hushed, like the first inhale after crying. Some described a strange warmth that came with it, like being seen. Others said it felt cold, but not the cruel kind, the kind that wakes you up. There were no rules about entering it, but there were whispers. They said, if you talked about it afterward, it would never appear for you again. They said the room knew the shape of your mind and would vanish the moment you tried to translate it into words. Of course, this made everyone want to describe it. They wrote in secret journals, trying to sketch the layout. A small table, one scribbled, a single blue light above. Another wrote, no corners. The room curves inward like a shell. But when they returned to where the room had been, it was gone. Only blank wall remained. Sometimes even the wall looked slightly different, as if the room had never been there at all. Thoth offered no clarification. He never even acknowledged the room's existence. But when one of the more ambitious students pressed him, demanding to know why something so sacred could be so easily lost, Thoth only smiled and said, some rooms exist only in the part of you that doesn't need to explain them. That was the punishment, not being locked out, but needing to speak too soon. Because the moment you described the room, whether with words or drawings or eager hands, you pulled it into the domain of logic. And it was never meant to live there. It was a room of experience, of immediacy, of presence. Inside, there were no lessons, no scrolls, no furniture, just you and something else. Something that didn't speak, but was never silent. It met you exactly where you were. For one person, it brought a wave of grief that cracked the spine open. For another, it offered the softest stillness, like being wrapped in the scent of your grandmother's house when you were 5. For another still, it was just nothing. But a nothing that felt like everything had been put down at last. The room didn't ask you questions, it was the answer, but only if you didn't try to carry it away. Those who returned from it quietly were changed, not in ways they could perform. They didn't speak more softly, or dress in more muted robes, but something had dropped, something weightless but heavy, like a veil that had once pressed against the eyes and was now gone. You could see it in how they moved, how they sat without fidgeting, how they listened without waiting to speak. One student, after a visit to the room, took a vow of silence, not out of piety, but because words no longer felt like the right shape. He gardened, he cooked, he helped the sick, and when asked what the room was like, he only smiled and held out a ripe plum. The other students thought he was being poetic, but he wasn't. That plum was the answer. That's how the room worked. It offered you something that could not be repeated, only expressed through how you lived after. And if you tried to name it, it disappeared. Not just from the walls, but from memory. Many students said they couldn't even remember what happened inside, only how they felt after, as if the experience had been absorbed by the bones, not the mind. Others, still hungry for proof, chased it. They set traps, placed candles to watch for flickering wind, measured bricks on the wall to catch structural changes. All of them failed. Some never saw the room again. One confessed that in his desperation to describe it, he wrote an entire scroll, and afterward, the words felt like someone else had written them. Hollow, rehearsed, dry. That was the warning, etched not in stone, but in memory. Do not name the sacred too soon, because once you name it, you've turned it into something it never was. You've pressed a living thing into a dead shape, and the room, the real room, only visits the ones who stop needing to tell others they were there. So they waited, they listened, they walked past its possible doors without touching them, and in doing so, the room returned again and again, not because they earned it, but because they stopped trying to possess it. That was the final lesson of Thoth's strangest punishments, that not everything is a punishment. Sometimes, what feels like silence is protection. Sometimes, what vanishes is simply too alive to be held in words. And sometimes, the holiest things you'll ever know are the ones you'll never be able to explain. And with that, the scroll closes. If you ever hear the soft knock of silence at your door, don't speak. Just listen. And maybe, just maybe, the room will return. Now sleep. The teachings have already made their way into you, like wind into stone, like memory into water. like a bell that only rings when no one is trying to hear it. Good night.